There is a ledger in the British Library, water-stained at the edges, that records the price of cotton cloth in a single Indian port across the span of one ordinary year. No battles appear in its columns. No kings are named. There are only numbers, bolts of fabric, weights of silver, the slow arithmetic of buying and selling. And yet, within those numbers lies one of the strangest facts in human history. The largest empire the world has ever known. An empire that at its height governed nearly a quarter of all the people alive, was not, for most of its existence, primarily an empire of soldiers. It was an empire of clerks, contracts, ships, ledgers, loans, and debts. It was assembled, more often than not by armies, marching across borders, but by the quiet pressure of money, paper, and the manipulation of men who already held power. This is the part of the story that gets lost beneath the cannon smoke. We remember the wars because wars are easy to remember. We picture redcoats in straight lines, gunboats on foreign rivers, and the dramatic surrender of defeated princes. And those things did happen. Britain fought often, and the violence it used was real and severe. But war was only the visible edge of a much deeper machine. The deeper machinery of British power ran on something less visible, and in many ways more difficult to resist than an army. It ran through warehouses, boardrooms, shipping routes, loans, treaties signed by candlelight, and the slow capture of one economy by another. To understand how a small, rain-soaked group of islands on the cold edge of Europe came to rule territory on every inhabited continent, we have to look away from the battlefield. We have to ask not only how Britain conquered, but how it persuaded, purchased, and indebted so much of the world into submission. Welcome to Uncovered History, where we uncover the forgotten decisions, hidden systems, and turning points that shaped the world we live in today. In this documentary, we explore how Britain built the largest empire in history without always relying on open conquest. This is not only a story of redcoats, cannons, and colonies. It is a story of trade, debt, geography, private companies, local alliances, and the invisible systems that made empire possible. If you enjoy serious cinematic history, forgotten power structures, and the deeper reasons behind world-changing events, make sure to subscribe to Uncovered History. Now, let's step back into the past and uncover how Britain built the largest empire without always fighting. Begin, for a moment, with the islands themselves, because geography set the terms of everything that followed. Britain is not large. It has no great rivers to rival the Nile or the Yangtze, no endless plains, no vast interior. What it has is a position. It sits at the western edge of Europe, surrounded by water, facing the open Atlantic. For most of recorded history, this position was not an advantage. Britain was a remote province, a place conquered by Romans and raided by Vikings, peripheral to the wealthy centers of the Mediterranean and the East. The currents of trade and civilization flowed elsewhere, but the world has a way of turning. When the center of global commerce shifted from the closed Mediterranean to the open ocean, when the route to the riches of Asia and the silver of the Americas began to run across the Atlantic, rather than through the deserts and inland routes of the Old World, Britain suddenly found itself in a very different place. It was no longer merely on the edge of Europe. It was facing the gateway to a new world. The sea, which had once isolated the islands, now connected them to everything. And the British, who had little to lose on land and a great deal to gain at sea, became people of the water. This is the first hidden force behind the empire, and it is worth pausing on. A continental empire expands by absorbing the land around it. Rome pushed outward across the Mediterranean. China expanded across plains, rivers, and frontiers. Alexander seized cities and kingdoms by marching through them. A continental empire thinks in terms of provinces, borders, roads, and frontiers. But a maritime empire thinks differently. It does not need to own all the land between 2 points. It needs only to control the points themselves, the harbor, the river mouth, the trading post, the island that commands a strait, the port where ships must stop, repair, refuel, and pay. It needs nodes, not endless territory. And nodes are cheaper. A continental empire must garrison 1,000 miles of border. A maritime empire can hold a few dozen good ports and the sea lanes between them. Through those slender threads, it can reach into the heart of vast and populous lands without always conquering them directly. This was the insight half stumbled upon and half designed. That made the British Empire possible. And the institution that first turned this insight into a system was not the British government at all. It was a company. In the year 1600, a group of London merchants received a royal charter to trade in the East. They called themselves the Honorable East India Company. At their founding, they were not conquerors. They were supplicants. They were latecomers in the Indian Ocean, arriving after the Portuguese and competing fiercely with the richer Dutch. India in that age was not a weak or backward place waiting to be taken. It was one of the wealthiest regions on earth. The Mughal Empire that ruled much of the subcontinent commanded revenues that dwarfed those of any European state. Its cities were larger than London. Its craftsmen produced textiles of a quality Europe could not match. To the rulers of India, the strange traders from the West were minor figures, useful, perhaps occasionally troublesome, but hardly a threat. When English representatives came seeking trading privileges in the early 17th century, they did not arrive as masters of the world. They arrived as petitioners at the edge of a far richer civilization. Here the story is often told backward, because we know how it ended. We are tempted to imagine that European dominance was inevitable from the beginning. But the evidence does not support so simple a picture. For the first century and more of its existence, the East India Company survived not by strength, but by accommodation. It paid for the right to trade. It flattered local rulers. It accepted local customs. It worked inside systems of power far older, and at the time far stronger than its own. What it possessed was not overwhelming military superiority. It possessed financial tools, patience, and a corporate structure built to endure. The company was a joint stock corporation, one of the early examples of a form that would come to dominate the modern world. This meant it could pool the capital of many investors, spread risk across many voyages, and sustain losses over long periods in pursuit of long-term gain. A king who borrowed to wage war had to win quickly or face ruin. A company could afford to wait. It could survive failed voyages, reinvest profits, absorb setbacks, and slowly build a position across decades. Behind it stood the emerging financial system of London, bankers, credit markets, investors, insurance, and the increasingly sophisticated machinery of debt. This mattered more than it may seem. Britain did not conquer with the wealth it already had. It conquered with the wealth it could borrow against the future. The ability to raise enormous loans, issue bonds, and convince lenders they would be repaid became a weapon as powerful as any cannon. A state or company that can borrow cheaply can outspend, outlast, and outmaneuver a rival who cannot, even if that rival is, on paper, much richer. Much of British expansion was, in the most literal sense, a triumph of accounting. And so the company grew, not as an empire at first, but as a commercial network. A string of fortified trading posts appeared along the coasts of India, in places that would become Madras, Bombay, and Calcutta. Notice the pattern. These were ports, nodes, points of access to the great markets of the interior. The company did not originally seek to govern India. It sought to trade with it. But the line between trade and power would not remain clear for long. The transformation from merchant to ruler was not planned in one grand design. It emerged from opportunity, crisis, and the peculiar incentives of a profit-seeking organization operating in a world where the old order was beginning to crack. That crack was the weakening of the Mughal Empire. By the early 1700s, the great structure that had held much of India together was fragmenting. The causes were many: succession disputes, overextension, the strain of ruling a vast and diverse realm, and the rise of regional powers that no longer obeyed the center. This is a pattern seen across many empires. A system grows too large for its own machinery. Power begins to drift from the capital to the provinces. Governors, generals, and princes begin acting as if the center no longer matters. As Mughal authority receded, India did not simply become weak, it became divided. Where once there had been one great power, now there were many competing ones. Regional rulers, ambitious governors, rival princes, and military households maneuvering against one another. Into this fractured landscape, the company inserted itself. Not as a unifier, not yet as a direct conqueror, but as one more player in a game of shifting alliances. And this is one of the deepest secrets of how Britain built its power. The company rarely conquered a united land. Instead, it entered existing divisions. The company offered its services, its disciplined soldiers, its money, its ships, to one local ruler against another. It backed claimants to thrones in exchange for trading rights and territory. It lent money to princes, and when the debts could not be paid, accepted land and revenue as collateral. It made itself indispensable to the quarrels of others. And with each quarrel, it emerged holding more power than before. The empire was built, to a remarkable degree, by local conflicts that the company learned to finance, manipulate, and profit from. The soldiers who fought these wars were themselves mostly Indian. This fact disturbs the simple picture of European conquest. The armies that extended British power across the subcontinent were overwhelmingly composed of local recruits, sepoys, trained and paid by the company, led by a thin layer of British officers. The company could not have conquered India with British soldiers alone. There were never enough of them, and the distance was too great. Instead, it assembled force from within India itself. It paid more reliably than many crumbling regional states. It imposed discipline. It offered regular service. It turned local manpower into an imperial machine. The genius, if we can call it that, was organizational. The company did not bring overwhelming force from outside. It built overwhelming force from within, using money and structure to turn a divided land into the instrument of its own subjugation. Consider the cold logic of it. A regional ruler facing a rival might welcome company troops as allies, not understanding that each alliance shifted the balance permanently. A prince in need of funds might accept a company loan, not seeing that the interest would become a leash. A merchant community might prefer the order the company imposed to the chaos of warring states, not realizing the price of that order. At each step, individual choices made sense in the moment. But together, they formed something no one had chosen as a whole. This is how systems capture societies, not always through one dramatic conquest, but through countless smaller transactions, each one reasonable, each one profitable. Each one tightening a net that becomes visible only after it has closed. There were, of course, moments of open warfare, and we should not pretend otherwise. In 1757, the Battle of Plassey in Bengal opened the door to company dominance over one of the wealthiest provinces in the world. But even there, the deciding factor was not simply battlefield strength, it was intrigue. The company victory was made possible by secret arrangements with local elites and commanders who abandoned the ruler of Bengal at the decisive moment. The fighting itself was almost secondary to the deal, making that came before it. The lesson the company learned was simple and devastating. It was cheaper to buy a victory than to fight for one. Cheaper to corrupt a court than to besiege a city. Cheaper to turn a kingdom's own elites against their ruler than to defeat that ruler in open war. What followed Bengal transformed the company and the entire future of British power. In 1765, the company acquired the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. This changed everything. Until then, the company had to bring silver from Europe to buy Indian goods, because Europe produced little that India wanted in return. India's textiles were in global demand. Its manufacturers produced cloth that European consumers desired. The trade balance often favored India. But once the company controlled Bengal's tax revenues, it no longer needed to bring its own money. It could use taxes collected from Indians to buy Indian goods. Then, it could sell those goods in Europe for profit. The land was now paying for its own exploitation. A trading relationship had become an extraction machine. The human consequences were severe. In 1770, Bengal suffered a catastrophic famine. Drought played a role, but the disaster was deepened by revenue extraction, market disruption, and the company's indifference to the society it now governed. We should be careful not to assign every death to deliberate policy. Famines are complex, and administrators were often as ignorant as they were greedy. But the broader truth is clear. A system designed to extract maximum revenue with minimum responsibility, run by a corporation answerable to distant shareholders rather than the people it ruled, was structurally indifferent to the suffering it produced. The famine was not an accident of nature alone. It was, in part, the predictable result of treating a living society as a balance sheet. This points to something extraordinary about the empire that was forming. It was not, at first, an empire in the traditional sense. Not a project of the British state, not a deliberate plan of national glory, not a crown-led crusade of conquest. It was a commercial enterprise that had stumbled into the business of ruling. And it ruled badly because ruling well had never been its purpose. The company existed to make money for its investors. Government was a means to that end, an inconvenient responsibility attached to the lucrative right of taxation. For decades, large parts of India were governed not by a king or parliament, but by a corporation. A private company with its own army, its own courts, its own officials, and its own political authority ruled tens of millions of people for profit. This was one of the most troubling arrangements in the history of human power. Eventually, news of company corruption reached Britain itself. The company's servants returned from India fabulously rich. Their fortunes were built on extraction, patronage, and political manipulation. They bought influence in British politics. They purchased seats in Parliament. They lived in a style that alarmed older elites. There arose a genuine anxiety that the corruption of empire abroad might poison political life at home. This is a recurring tension in the story of empires. The violence and arbitrary power exercised at the frontier has a way of flowing back toward the center. The British worried that in conquering India, they might lose something of themselves. Over the following decades, control gradually shifted from the company to the British state. The government intervened. It regulated. It investigated. It slowly took over. After the Great Uprising of 1857, the company was abolished as a governing power. In 1858, India came under direct rule of the British Crown. A commercial empire had become a political one. But the underlying logic remained. Even as the state replaced the corporation, the empire continued to run on principles the company had pioneered. Control the nodes, not necessarily every inch of territory. Rule through local intermediaries where possible. Extract revenue to fund further expansion. Use the resources of the conquered to finance conquest. Prefer money, debt, alliance, and divide and rule. When open war was too expensive, this preference for the indirect over the direct became one of the defining features of British imperialism worldwide. Across much of the world, the British did not govern directly at all. They ruled through a patchwork of protected princes, client kings, treaty ports, spheres of influence, puppet rulers, commercial agreements, and financial dependency. In India itself, hundreds of princely states continued to exist throughout the imperial period. Their rulers kept titles, courts, ceremonies, and dignity. But real power often sat beside them in the form of a British resident or advisor. This was empire on the cheap. And precisely because it was cheap, flexible, and indirect, it could stretch across an enormous scale. Historians sometimes call this informal empire. It describes the parts of the world Britain controlled without formally conquering them. Regions where British banks held the debt. British merchants dominated the trade. British shipping carried the goods. British gunboats waited offshore. Local governments remained technically sovereign, but found they could do little that London truly opposed. A country did not need to be painted red on the map to be inside the British system. It only needed to owe British creditors. It needed to depend on British shipping. It needed to trade in markets Britain dominated. In this sense, the British Empire was larger than any map could show. So much of it was invisible. A web of financial and commercial dependence rather than a territory of flags and garrisons. Debt runs through this story like a hidden current. Again and again, the pattern repeated. A ruler or government needed money to build a railway, modernize an army, pay for a war, or sustain a lavish court. British banks, backed by the deepest capital markets in the world, were willing to lend. The loans were made. The interest accumulated, and when repayment became difficult, the lender gained leverage. Perhaps customs revenue had to be handed over. Perhaps a British financial advisor had to oversee the treasury. Perhaps force had to be threatened to ensure debts were honored. Step by step, financial dependence became political dependence. A sovereign nation could find that its most important decisions were being made somewhere else. One classic example unfolded in Egypt in the 19th century. Egypt's rulers borrowed enormous sums from European lenders to fund modernization, including projects connected to the Suez Canal. When the Suez Canal opened in 1869, it transformed the route between Europe and Asia. For Britain, the canal was more than a waterway. It was an imperial artery. It shortened the route to India and became one of the most important strategic choke points on Earth. When Egypt's debts overwhelmed its treasury, European powers intervened to protect their investments. Britain, above all, could not allow instability around the canal. When resistance rose against foreign financial control, Britain sent troops in 1882. It did not initially annex Egypt in the simple formal sense. Instead, it occupied it. Egypt remained, on paper, tied to another empire and later claimed a form of autonomy. But in practice, for decades, British influence dominated its politics, finances, and strategic direction. Here was informal empire in one of its clearest forms, control achieved through debt and finance, enforced by occasional force, maintained without always using the full language of colonization. The canal itself reveals the logic of the whole empire. Britain's power rested on the sea and on the lines of communication that connected its scattered possessions. The empire was a circulatory system. Its rulers thought obsessively about choke points, straits, canals, harbors, coaling stations, and ports where ships could refuel and repair. Hold the critical points, and you could command the routes. Command the routes, and you could influence the world. This was very different from the empires that came before. A continental conqueror measured power in land. The number of provinces, the distance from one frontier to another, the size of the army that could occupy roads, fields, towns, and villages. The British measured power differently. They measured it in the volume of trade passing through ports, in the share of the world's shipping that flew their flag, in the sums their banks lent abroad, in the choke points they controlled. Theirs was an empire of flows rather than soil, and this is why it could be so vast with so little. A continental empire must physically occupy everything it claims. But Britain, by controlling the points through which goods, money, and ships had to pass, could exert influence over enormous regions while occupying only a fraction of them. It found a way to be everywhere by being, in fact, almost nowhere, a thin network of control stretched across a quarter of the planet. But we should not let the elegance of the system obscure its costs. Indirect rule was not gentle rule. The absence of constant war did not mean the absence of suffering. The reordering of economies to serve British interests had devastating effects on the people caught within it. And nowhere was this clearer than in India's textile economy. At the beginning of this story, India was one of the great workshops of the world's cotton cloth. Its weavers produced fabrics of remarkable quality that were traded across Asia, Africa, and Europe. India was, in a real sense, a manufacturing heart of the early modern world. But as British industry mechanized, as the factories of Manchester and Lancashire began producing cloth by machine at far lower cost, the relationship inverted. British policy, backed by imperial control, opened India to British manufactured goods, while limiting India's ability to protect its own industries. The flood of cheap machine-made cloth devastated handloom weavers. A region that had been one of the world's greatest exporters of textiles became a captive market for British factories and a supplier of raw cotton. An advanced manufacturing economy was pushed over generations toward producing raw materials for someone else's industry. This was one of the deepest forms of imperial violence, and it was violence almost entirely without battles. It was the violence of economic restructuring, rules written in distant offices, tariffs and policies that redirected wealth. Markets opened by power, then described as freedom. Livelihoods destroyed without a single city being stormed. No army was needed to ruin the weavers of Bengal. It was done with policy. The genius and cruelty of the British Empire lay in the same place, its ability to dominate through structures so impersonal that they barely looked like domination at all. A man whose livelihood was destroyed by a change in trade policy had no enemy he could easily see, no invader standing in his doorway. Only the faceless workings of a global system that had decided his labor was no longer wanted. Here we arrive at the central paradox of how Britain built its empire. The very features that made it effective also made it difficult to resist. Its reliance on commerce over conquest, debt over war, local intermediaries over direct rule, impersonal systems over naked force. A conquering army is a clear enemy. You can see it. Name it, fight it, hate it, rally against it. But how do you resist alone? How do you fight a tariff? How do you rally a people against the slow, quiet process by which their economy is captured and their rulers are turned into clients? For much of its existence, the British Empire was a thing without a single face. A network of contracts, obligations, dependencies, ports, banks, companies, and officials. Those caught inside it often could not clearly see the whole structure that bound them. That was its strength. It was also one reason it endured for so long. We have traced how the system began. A trading company in a divided land discovered that money and intrigue could achieve what armies often could not. That discovery grew into a global method of power built on commerce, debt, and control of the world's vital roots. But a system this vast raises deeper questions. How did a small island justify ruling so much of humanity, not only to the world, but to itself? What did the people living under this empire actually experience? And why, after building something so durable and profitable, did it eventually come apart? To answer those questions, we must turn from the machinery of conquest to the machinery of belief. Every empire that rules over others must answer a question its conquests can never settle on their own. By what right? Force can take a city. Debt can capture an economy. Intrigue can turn one prince against another. But none of these things can make domination feel legitimate. An empire that rests on naked extraction alone must spend forever putting down the resistance it provokes. The British understood this, sometimes consciously, and sometimes by instinct. So alongside the machinery of commerce and control, they built a machinery of justification. A structure of ideas, stories, and beliefs designed to explain why this arrangement of the world was not merely profitable, but proper, even noble. The justification evolved over time. In the earliest period, when empire was frankly commercial, little justification was needed beyond profit. Trade enriched the nation, and that was reason enough. But as the empire grew, as it came to govern hundreds of millions of people, profit alone became uncomfortable. A different story was needed. And so British rule was increasingly presented, not as exploitation, but as improvement. Britain claimed to bring order to chaos, law to lawlessness, progress to stagnation, civilization to peoples imagined as backward and in need of guidance. The empire recast itself as a moral undertaking, a burden reluctantly carried for the good of the governed. We must examine this idea carefully. It was neither entirely cynical nor remotely true. Many imperial officials genuinely believed they were doing good. They built railways, telegraph lines, harbors, schools, universities, courts, and irrigation works. These were real, and some had lasting effects. But the story of improvement hid uncomfortable truths. Railways were often built primarily to move British goods to market and British troops to trouble spots. The economy was restructured for the benefit of the imperial center, not the colonized periphery. And beneath the language of civilization lay a deeper assumption that the peoples of the empire were lesser, incapable of governing themselves, and in permanent need of supervision. This belief was not incidental, it was load-bearing. Without it, the whole structure of imperial justification collapsed. Because if the colonized were equal and capable, there could be no honest reason to deny them control over their own lives. This is one of the more troubling truths about how empires sustain themselves. to rule others against their will over long periods. An empire must convince itself that those others are not fully its equals. The alternative, to see clearly that one is dominating fellow human beings for one's own benefit, is too uncomfortable to sustain. The ideology of racial and civilizational hierarchy was not merely a prejudice that existed alongside the British Empire. It was one of the stories that made the empire psychologically possible. And like all such stories, it had a terrible cost. It shaped how millions were treated, what opportunities they were denied, and how they came to see themselves under the long pressure of being told they were less. Yet here we encounter one of history's deep ironies. The very institutions Britain built to serve its rule contained the seeds of the empire's undoing. Schools and universities were established partly to train local administrators, clerks, lawyers, and officials who could help run the vast machine of government. There were never enough Britons to govern the empire alone, so the empire educated subjects to help administer it. But those institutions taught the language, law, and political ideas of Britain itself. And among those ideas were the most dangerous ones the empire could possibly export: liberty, representation, the rule of law, the right of a people to govern themselves, the idea that legitimate authority rests on the consent of the governed. Britain taught these principles to the people it ruled while denying them in practice. The contradiction could not be hidden forever. Across the empire, educated men and women absorbed the political philosophy of their rulers and turned it back upon them. If consent was the basis of legitimate rule, then by what right did Britain govern without consent? If liberty was a universal principle, why did it stop at the edge of empire? If law protected rights, why were imperial subjects denied equality? The empire had armed its subjects with the intellectual weapons of its own dismantling. To understand the slow turning of the empire toward its end, we must descend from ideas to lived experience. The empire was not an abstraction to the people inside it. It was the price of salt, the tax on land, the recruiting sergeant, the magistrate, the railway carrying away the harvest, the policy that ruined the loom. For hundreds of millions, empire was the frame of an entire life. For a farmer in India, the empire might be felt most directly in the demand for revenue, the fixed requirement to produce a certain sum whether the rains came or failed. Older systems of rule, for all their faults, often had local flexibility. A ruler who pushed peasants too hard might face revolt, flight, or starvation. There were customs, negotiations, and limits. The imperial system, by contrast, often operated through targets set in distant offices. It could be rigid, abstract, and indifferent. When famine came, the response was frequently shaped less by the needs of the starving than by economic doctrines imported from Britain. Doctrines that feared interference with markets. Doctrines that treated relief as dangerous. Doctrines that allowed grain to move according to price while people died nearby. The history of these famines is complex, and not every death can be laid at one door. But the broad pattern is difficult to deny. A system that treated a living society as an economic abstraction proved capable of presiding over mass suffering while convinced of its own correctness. For merchants and artisans, empire had different effects. The opening of markets to British goods ruined many who had once prospered, especially textile producers. But others found opportunities inside the new order. Some supplied raw materials. Some acted as middlemen. Some served British firms. Some invested in imperial trade. Some entered the bureaucracy. The empire created winners as well as losers among the colonized. And this was essential to how it worked. A purely extractive system that benefited no one among the conquered would have faced united resistance. But an empire that enriched some people offered advancement to others and created a class with a stake in its continuation-bound part of the population, to itself by interest rather than force. Divide and rule was not only a strategy of playing princes against each other, it was also a strategy of dividing society into those who gained and those who lost. Resistance could then be met not only by British power, but by collaborators who feared what might happen if the system disappeared. For soldiers, the contradiction was even sharper. The sepoy who served in imperial armies was both an instrument of conquest and often a proud professional. He was paid, fed, trained, and given status. Yet he served a power that regarded him as inferior, used his loyalty, and denied him equality. This contradiction ran through the heart of the imperial military, and in 1857 it erupted. The Great Uprising in India began in part among sepoys who turned against the company. It spread into a vast rebellion that came closer than is often remembered to shaking British power loose from the subcontinent. It was suppressed with ferocity, but it left a permanent mark. It revealed how thin British control really was, how dependent the empire remained on the cooperation of the very people it ruled. This fragility cuts against the image of the empire as overwhelming and irresistible. In truth, the British Empire was always thinly stretched. It governed far more people than it could ever have controlled by force alone. It depended on local elites, colonial soldiers, merchant networks, administrators, and the belief that British power was permanent. Its strength was real. But it was also precarious. So long as enough people believed it could not be resisted, it did not always have to prove that it could not. But belief is fragile, and when it began to erode, the whole structure proved far less solid than it appeared. That erosion came from many directions at once. First, the empire's own ideas turned against it. As education spread, as self-government and national identity took root, movements arose demanding the rights Britain claimed to cherish but refused to fully extend. These movements were often not armies. They were political organizations, led by lawyers, journalists, students, workers, religious figures, and activists who understood the language of empire and used it against empire. They organized, petitioned, protested, built mass movements, made countries increasingly difficult to govern. In India, nonviolent resistance posed a problem. The imperial system was poorly equipped to answer. An empire built to suppress armed revolt found itself confronting millions who simply withdrew cooperation. They refused to obey. They filled prisons. They exposed the violence beneath the empire's civilized self-image. Such resistance forced Britain to choose between moral legitimacy and imperial control. In the long run, it could not keep both. The second force was economic. Empire had always been justified partly by the wealth it brought to Britain. But over time, the calculation became more complicated. Administering and defending so vast a domain was enormously expensive. The costs of governance, armies, naval protection, policing, and suppressing unrest mounted steadily. The benefits often flowed to particular interests rather than the nation as a whole. The empire that had been built to enrich Britain became, in some measure, a burden Britain carried. As new industrial powers rose, and as the global economy shifted, the comfortable assumption that empire paid for itself became harder to sustain. An empire is a bargain. When the costs begin to outweigh the gains, the will to pay those costs erodes. Not all at once, but gradually. With every crisis, every revolt, every military expense, every colonial demand, the same question returned. Was it worth it? The third and decisive force was the catastrophe of the great wars of the 20th century. These wars drained Britain of wealth, men, and confidence. To fight them, Britain called upon the empire for soldiers and resources on an enormous scale. Millions of colonial subjects served in wars fought in the name of freedom, while they themselves were denied full freedom. That contradiction could not survive the peace. Men who had fought abroad returned home, unwilling to accept subjection, and Britain itself emerged exhausted, indebted, and diminished. The financial machinery that had once built the empire now told a different story. Britain was no longer simply the world's great creditor. It had become deeply dependent on others. The arithmetic that once favored expansion now favored retreat, and so the empire ended, not usually in a single dramatic collapse, but in a long sequence of withdrawals, negotiations, crises, and reluctant departures spread across decades. Territory by territory, the flags came down. Some transitions were relatively peaceful. Others were accompanied by terrible violence, the hasty drawing of borders, the sudden departure of imperial authority, and the division of communities left behind conflicts that would burn for generations. The manner of the empire's leaving was often as careless as its arrival had been calculated. The consequences of borders drawn in haste, societies divided, and states improvised in the rush to depart remain visible on the map of the world today. Here, too, easy judgments can be misleading. The choices were difficult, and outcomes were shaped by many hands. But the pattern is clear enough. An empire assembled with patient cunning was dismantled with anxious speed, and the seams of that hurried unmaking remain visible in the present. What, then, are we to make of this story? What changed? What survived? And why should we remember it now? The first thing that survived is the world the empire made. The British Empire helped create the interconnected global economy we now inhabit. The patterns of trade it established, the financial systems it pioneered, the flows of goods, capital, people, language, law, and institutions. These did not vanish when the flags came down. The dominance of the English language, the spread of British legal and political forms, the borders of many modern nations, and the shape of global commerce, all bear the empire's imprint. We live, in a real sense, in a world it helped build. The second thing that survived is the wound. The empire's reordering of the world was not gentle. The marks it left, economic, political, psychological, endured in the societies it transformed. Economies restructured to serve a distant center did not easily recover their independence. Societies told for generations that they were inferior did not easily shed that imposed image. Borders drawn for imperial convenience continue to generate conflict. The story of empire is not a closed chapter sealed safely in the past. It is a set of structures and consequences that still shape the lives of billions. To understand the present world, its inequalities, tensions, connections, and contradictions, we must understand the empire that did so much to make it. But there is a deeper lesson here. The British Empire is often remembered as a story of conquest, redcoats, gunboats, and famous battles. Yet the truth is stranger and more unsettling. It was built far less by armies than by accountants, less by generals than by merchants and bankers, less by the dramatic violence of war than by the quiet violence of debt, trade, and the patient capture of one society's economy by another. Its deepest power lay not only in its ability to conquer, it lay in its ability to make domination look like commerce, to make exploitation look like improvement, to make subjection look like the natural order of things. This is why the story matters now. We live in a world where power is still often exercised through finance, trade, networks, choke points, supply chains, debts, currencies, ports, data, and dependency. The empire of flags has largely passed, but the empire of flows, the empire of contracts, debts, markets, and dependencies is still with us. To understand how a small island built the largest empire in history without always fighting is to understand something essential about power. Power does not always announce itself with drums and cannon fire. It does not always arrive wearing a uniform. Sometimes it arrives as a contract, a loan, a port agreement, a shipping route, a tariff, a ledger, a promise of improvement, a system too large and impersonal for any single person to see whole. The merchants who kept those water-stained ledgers, recording the price of cloth in forgotten ports, did not imagine they were building an empire. They thought they were doing business, and perhaps that is the most disquieting truth of all. The greatest empire the world has ever known was assembled, in large part, by people pursuing profit, following incentives, and making reasonable decisions one transaction at a time. There was no single master plan, no single mind directing it all. Only the patient, accumulating logic of a system that turned commerce into conquest so gradually that even those who built it could scarcely say when trading had become ruling. That is the shadow the empire leaves behind. Not only the memory of its battles, but the example of its method. It showed the world how to dominate without always seeming to dominate, how to extract without always appearing to take, how to build a structure of power so woven into the ordinary workings of trade and money that those caught within it might not clearly see the net until it had already closed. The ledgers have faded now. Their ink has gone pale. Many of their ports have been renamed, transformed, or forgotten. But the system they recorded and the lesson they hold has never really left us. And perhaps that is the final thing to understand about how Britain built an empire without always fighting. The most lasting conquests are often the ones that never look like conquest at all.